Good morning, everyone. I'm Rob Atkinson. I'm president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. And we're really delighted to host this event this morning on the current state of U.S. manufacturing, where it's likely to be going, and most importantly, what are the things that we need to do as a country, including in Congress, to make sure that we have a robust future for manufacturing and manufacturing jobs. We'll proceed today with a short presentation, keynote presentation. We're going to have the first panel on a little bit about kind of where we are, where we're going. Then we'll switch over to a second panel, which will be a deeper dive into technology questions, particularly around smart manufacturing, or what people call industrial internet or industry 4.0, and then we'll adjourn precisely at 11:15. We were really I'm looking forward to hearing from Alberto, but we were really looking forward to hearing from Alberto Valle, who's the CEO of IMA, which is one of the leading global companies that makes packaging equipment. In other words, most of what we buy has a package around it, and there's incredibly complex machinery that allows companies to package. And IMA is a company that does that, and Mr. Valle was planning to be in town today, and we thought, what a great opportunity to hear from him about how he sees Europe and America in manufacturing. Unfortunately, he had a minor illness and wasn't able to come to the States, but we are fortunate that his colleague Alberto Forcielli happens to be also in town. So Alberto's going to step in and pinch hit here. Alberto is actually, through his company, one of the major investors in IMA. And he's also a very close colleague with Mr. Valle, so he can channel Mr. Valle's thoughts as well as provide his own. Alberto is the founding partner of Mandarin Capital Partners. He has a really deep background in economic policy globally. He has worked for the Italian government, the Italian special advisor to the Italian Minister of Defense, the Minister of the Budget, Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He also is a leading expert in China. He writes regularly for the Kaizen media, which if you haven't seen that, it's worth looking at, and has his own English language blog, albertoforcielli.com, and also tweets extensively, but I think it's mostly in Italian. But really is a deep knowledge, and in particular, a deep knowledge of what's going on in China. Spent many years in Southeast Asia, investing in China, understanding China, looking at what China's doing in manufacturing. He has a MBA from the Harvard Business School and a bachelor's in economics from the University of Bologna. So with that, Alberto.
Thank you. I keep my iPhone here. I'm not chatting. Just my speech is here. Just thank you very much. I'm very honored to speak to such a distinguished audience. I'll spend a few words on European manufacturing. To us, European manufacturing is extremely important. We do cherish it very much. I mean, for whatever manufacturing is left in Europe, that manufacturing pays pretty good salaries. I mean, vis-a-vis services, because services, you can be like a partner in Goldman Sachs, but you can also be like a teller in McDonald's. But if you are in a good manufacturing company competing globally, if you are working at Volkswagen or Audi or Siemens, you are pretty big shot in town. You take home a significant salary. So for whatever manufacturing is left, we see it as the treasure to preserve. And also keep in mind that we Europeans do not have many alternatives to manufacturing. If you take the UK away, because UK is no longer with us, the continental Europe does not have a service industry. We don't have IT, we don't have media, we don't have the Microsoft, we don't have the Google, we don't have the Amazon, we don't have all of that. So we haven't developed that side. We're really behind. So we really had to stick to what we know how to do, because we have not been very extremely innovative. And another point I want to make, the idea. There is this, if you talk to economists, most economists will tell you, well, it's natural. As the countries evolve, the service component will grow, and manufacturing will decrease. Well, thanks a lot. Then I spent a long time in Singapore. Okay. Now, this is an example. Singapore is the richest country in the world, I believe, in terms of income per capita, GDP per capita. It has one of the largest, second largest harbor in the world, so it's tremendous service economy built around the harbor. It's a significant asset management center. I mean, fund management is big. People take money in Singapore. Singapore has replaced Switzerland as probably the largest asset management country in the world. Plus, Singapore is a tremendous retail economy. I mean, people come from all over Asia to shop in Singapore. Well, the island is probably like 20-mile wide, or 25 and 15 miles long. It's a trapezoid like this. Guess how much industrial GDP is in Singapore? 18%. Guess how much industrial GDP is in the States? Does anybody know? 12. I mean, in the richest country in the world, even the most homogeneous, not even the most unequal, you barely can see these factors, and still manufacturing accounts for 18% of the economy. And you think they wouldn't need it. Now, let me give you a few things about Europe that I think are significant. Europe has doesn't reach 2% R&D expenses on GDP. The US is 2.74, which is higher, and Germany is the top with 2.9, Italy is the bottom, 1.3. However, our European traditional manufacturing does pretty well. I mean, think of the car industry. Think about the Audi, the Volkswagen, the Mercedes vis-a-vis GM, Ford, and Chrysler. I mean, the automatic machinery industry, basically in the U.S. has disappeared. Take away from the U.S. aerospace and defense. It's okay, but it's not great. However, the two countries have spent almost the same. The big difference is, I think, this is my theory, I'm not sure it's well-founded, but a lot of R&D expenditure in the US have gone into innovative industries, and you can see the result. There are whole sectors that don't exist in Europe. We don't have a Google again, we don't have an Amazon, Europe does not have a social network. So the US has been pretty good at shifting this R&D in new sectors away from traditional sectors. While Europe, in the whole of Europe, we don't have an innovative ecosystem. Innovative ecosystem are Boston, Silicon Valley, Tel Aviv, Singapore, Shenzhen, Bangalore, Shanghai, none. The amount of venture capital in Europe is probably less than 100. It's not even $1 billion a year. I think Silicon Valley is 20. The rest of the US is probably 30. I think the overall volume of VC volume in the US could be around 50. So 1 to 50, how much is it? Like 2%? So we don't have anything new, but we do spend, and what we spend is in keeping what we have, innovating what we have. That's why manufacturing is important. That's a lesson, because we have to, since we're not good at doing much else, we need to keep what we have. But there's also a lesson for the US. Had the US spent more, they could have kept more. It wouldn't need to be 12%. It could be easily 20. There is there is anything between 5 to 8% of GDP missing there for neglect. And over there, I have my own theory, which is what I can see in everyday business. I mean, traditionally, the exit cost for industrial companies in the US have been way too low. You can shut a plant in 3 months here and get the hell out. Try to do the same in Europe. You go like through hell, misery. I mean, so it's very easy for anybody to say, oh, why should I invest here? I mean, I may as well move everything over to Malaysia or something. We made it a little bit too easy, okay? And also psychologically, I was in business school, class of 81. Back then, it's almost 4 years, there was nobody that ever considered then having an interview with a manufacturing company. We were all thinking about consulting, investment banking, banks. Now the big thing in business school is startups. Yeah, great startups. But you keep building something new, but you forgot the old, so it's just like, it's hard. You know, you should keep what we have and build on top of it. But I'm not here to preach on another interesting point. Manufacturing is important. Europe is very different. You can't say, every country is different institutions, different features. However, Eastern Europe, manufacturing is 40% on GDP. 40% is a big chunk. Germany, we are around 28%. Italy, we are around 25%, with a big difference. North of Italy much more, and southern Italy much less. France is around 20. The lowest country, the country has the lowest manufacturing is Luxembourg, 11.7, which is, again, I've been in Luxembourg. I lived in Luxembourg. I used to work at the European Investment Bank, which is a development bank, like the World Bank. And I used to have a bicycle hobby then, so I went back and forth in Singapore. I know every single street corner. When I read that Singapore has 11.7% in manufacturing, I said, whoa, where is manufacturing? Have you ever been to Luxembourg? How many manufacturing plants have you seen in Luxembourg? None. Well, I mean, according to the numbers, the US is like Luxembourg. Luxembourg 11.7, the US is 12%. I mean, it doesn't sound right. Let me go on. Yeah. Because I'm stealing a lot of points from Mr. Vacchi, by the way. And people will stop calling. Now, wrap up. Oh, wrap up. Well, we do have issues, okay? Let's tell what the issues that European manufacturers face. The first is everything has been based on mechanics, on being good at perfecting mechanics, and manufacturing has been mainly done by mechanical engineer or chemical engineer. But now, the incremental improvement you can achieve through better mechanics is marginal. Now the future is all software. And then we have a huge problem there, because Europe is not good at software at all. There is SAP in Germany, that everybody knows. That's about it, okay? And that means the attraction for the States, the attraction for, you simply don't find good software engineers in Europe. And especially, it's not a school. There is not a tradition. You know, to build a competence, you need generation and generation and generation. You have to build up. You don't just like get new kids out of college. So the whole thing, moving towards software, plays into the US hands. You know, talk to any manufacturer in Europe, they want to buy AI stuff here. They want to buy 3D printers here. I mean, I'm familiar with the MIT. MIT is flooded by the Bosch, by the BMW this world. They go and try to scrape and buy and look at whatever is possible to buy, because that thing simply doesn't exist. The second major threat, not to be underestimated, I see every day, is a tremendous improvement of China. I've been in Asia for almost 25 years, living all over Asia, and I'm on my way to Bangkok tomorrow. Like 10 years ago, I had a European company, because that's part of my business. Everybody would come to me, every Chinese would come to me and say, oh, just come over and we'll do a JV because, you know, they make such good equipment and so on. And it was very easy for me to invest because I really like to invest in European company with Asian upside. Now, 1 out of 30. European company come to me and says, I want to be in China. I go to China. Chinese don't care because Chinese are up to 90%. They're not as good as we are, but they've reached 90% perfection. So they say, well, the cost premium, the price premium you require to make that production in China doesn't justify. I may as well buy, I may as well stick to my Chinese machinery, which is 10% less efficient, but half the price. So, but this is not the only thing. In fact, the fact is, these guys are coming in, and they're cutting us off in emerging market. I mean, if they go to Pakistan does not buy a German machine. And they prefer to buy a Chinese machine. Half the price, 90% as good, come with a bundle of financing, who the heck cares? So they're really undermining in the emerging market. We don't, we may not see it, but they are. And the second thing, for most industrial player, because Europe is big in industrial, the very big consumer goods are mainly American, from P&G to whatever, okay? If you talk to industrial, the whole market is shifting to Asia. Because if you look at like 50% of industrial product, they're manufactured here. So our clients are more and more in Asia. Now we find not only undermined by Asian competitors, mainly Chinese, in our traditional markets, but we also find that we have to go and compete for Chinese clients. They have their own industry. So they have to either buy imported machinery and vis-a-vis local machinery with all the custom and everything accruing to it. And so it's becoming hard. So we're very scared. I really have no solution. But I'm not that far off from thinking that a new rethinking of the WTO or some protection is needed. That's about it. I may have a third point, but I'm okay, right?
You're good. Well, let me ask you one. So, I thought first of all, that was great, thank you. And I thought this point about the U.S. really kind of embracing the new but forgetting the old. It's really the flip side of Europe. Europe has embraced the old, sort of either forgets the new or sometimes demonizes the new. They can't be new, they're going to try to knock us down a peg because we're new. And I think that sort of getting that balance right between the old and the new, you got to do both. I think that was really an important point. And the second is this, that sort of mechanics has reached its peak, and that to go further, you have to integrate digital or software and mechanics. And at some level, that's a strength of the US and it's a weakness of Europe, although perhaps we could do better at mechanics. So. Thoughts on that? Want to say a couple more things on that and wrap up?
I don't know. I just now more thoughts on that. I just it's all about. I think it's it. No, there is another point maybe I want to make, that since I cannot answer this because I reached my maximum level of incompetence. There is another point I want to make that relates to you. One big Europe differential. One of the reasons European industry has held on though is being the proximity of Eastern countries. So there's been a lot of outsourcing and relocation from Germany to Poland, from Italy to Romania. I mean, there are countries like the Slovak Republic. They are like almost a full employment. So to us, having the buffer the Eastern Europe is allowed to keep going. So what I see, while I'm very, very aggressive and not indulgent vis-a-vis China, I do have a soft spot for Mexico and the role that Mexico played for the US. So when I hear this sort of wild discussion about NAFTA and chopping out Mexico, okay, if someone comes to me and says we have to chop off Poland, the Slovak Republic, Slovenia, Czech Republic, Hungary, I don't like it. I mean, it's going to chop our feet off. So that I would use some caution in that.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That was great. And I want to turn us over now to our panel. Let me introduce the three panelists, and then we'll jump right in. To my immediate left, Clyde Prestowitz. If you are involved in competitiveness strategy, Clyde needs no introduction. He's, I would say, the godfather in DC on competitiveness strategy. He's the founder and president of the Economic Strategy Institute. He played key roles in the Reagan administration on competitiveness policy. He's written, how many books? 5?
8 books.
Yeah, who's counting? Okay. I got 3.5, Clyde, so almost with you. You know, really a wonderful books. He has served as vice chairman of the President's Committee on Trade and Investment. He sits on the Intel Policy Advisory Board, on the Ex-Im Bank Advisory Board, so travels extensively around. We were competing on how many miles we've traveled this year, and Clyde beat me, I'm sure, beats me every year. Travels all around the world and really understands this in a deep way. Phil Singerman, longtime colleague and friend. Phil is the Associate Director for Innovation and Industry Services at NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Phil's really been looking at these questions for a long time. He used to be head of the Economic Development Administration in the Clinton administration, and now in his role at NIST, he is responsible for a whole suite of external partnership programs, and perhaps most importantly for our purposes today, the Manufacturing Extension Partnership Program, which Phil will talk about and why that's important. And finally, Cliff Waldman, who is the chief economist at the MAPI Foundation. MAPI is the Manufacturers Alliance for Productivity and Innovation, exactly, which is a trade association looking very deeply at really these questions around innovation and manufacturing. And Cliff is, I would say, the deepest and most distinguished economist, really understands these questions at a sort of micro and meso industry level. So Cliff, thank you for joining us. So let me just make a couple of opening sort of framing remarks, and then I want to have a discussion here. If you could indulge me for just a moment in a thought experiment. Imagine for a moment that we have a intellectual consensus in Washington that is deep and across the board that says that we need a robust national manufacturing policy. Now imagine that that's supported by every major think tank in Washington, from Cato to CAP, that they say this on a pretty regular basis. Imagine that every major economist, from Paul Krugman to Greg Mankiw, is banging the drum for Congress to act. Imagine that most of the pundits, from George Will to Tom Friedman, are banging that drum. I'm talking about a fantasy world, because they don't do that. They simply do not do that. There is either just lack of interest or outright opposition. Now, why is that? To me, one of the sort of emblematic examples of that was Alan Blinder recently. Alan Blinder was the head of Council of Economic Advisors for Clinton. He's a prominent economist at Princeton. Alan Blinder was talking about the loss of the U.S. television industry, which, by the way, was a loss caused largely by faulty antitrust policy in the U.S. that forced RCA to give away their technology to the Japanese. Alan Blinder said, The loss, the complete decimation of the U.S. television industry was not a failure. It represented an unalloyed success because it meant we moved to something we were supposed to be better at. So when Keynes said the problem with economics is that we're slaves to long-dead economists, the problem today is that we're slaves both to long-dead economists and living economists. And I would suggest there's 5 major intellectual mistakes that think tanks, economists, and pundits make with this space. One is that they just simply don't care. They don't understand that manufacturing is an important component of a national economy. The best example of that was a former president of a major international policy think tank here in Washington, who, when asked how much manufacturing could the United States lose and still be okay, his answer was, all of it. All of it. We don't need any manufacturing to be okay. The second major intellectual mistake that most of these people make is that the fact that we're running a massive trade deficit in manufacturing, upwards of $500–600 billion in any particular year, has nothing to do with our competitiveness, has nothing to do with foreign trade policies, nothing to do with the fact we're not investing in skills enough, nothing. It's all due to the fact that we don't save enough. Now, problem with that is savings and the trade deficit are in an equation that they have to equal. But what these people make the mistake of is they say that lack of savings causes the trade deficit. They're putting in correlation with causation. And when you really look at the evidence and the other work, they simply are not causal. We don't run a trade deficit because we don't save enough. The third mistake, and I know Cliff can talk about this as well, we lost 1/3 of our manufacturing jobs in the 2000s, the greatest rate of loss in American history, and the second greatest rate of loss of any country ever in the world. Now, when you listen to all of these economists, they will say that's because we had the greatest productivity and all of these jobs were lost due to productivity. I won't go into the details of why that's wrong. We've written extensively about that, as have a number of economists like Sue Hausman at the Upjohn Institute. It wasn't all from productivity. Perhaps half of it was from productivity, but half of it was due to the U.S. losing competitive position globally, what Alberto was talking about, a lot of companies moving or foreign companies taking market share. The fourth, I think, intellectual mistake is Alberto talked about a little bit about, Chinese costs are going up, U.S. costs are going down relative. And there's this view, in Boston Consulting Group, sort of emblematic of that, we'll just be able to outcompete these countries because our costs are going down relatively and it'll become cheap to make things here. First of all, it's not really true. The Chinese costs are going up, but their productivity is going up equally as fast, if not faster. So labor costs are not the issue. It's labor costs related to productivity. And secondly, do we really want a vision where we're making where our manufacturers or workers are making $9.50 an hour, and that's how we're competitive? We don't want it. Why would we want that? The Germans are competitive globally with the Chinese, and their manufacturing wages in dollar-denominated terms are 43% higher than U.S. So that can't be the answer. And lastly, there is this sort of assumption that we will be able to thrive and prevail because of new technological innovations, which is the subject of the second panel. I don't have any doubt that this next wave of innovations in manufacturing, what people call smart manufacturing, is a really important thing. But I don't fundamentally believe that it will just naturally happen and we will naturally win. For us to be able to take advantage of that next wave, we're going to have very good policies, including policies to help the SME sectors that Phil's involved with to be able to capture that. So I wish and hope that after this and everybody watches the video on Monday, that by next week the intellectual framework in Washington will have fundamentally changed and they will have all come around to our view. And then after the holidays, we'll get a national manufacturing strategy installed in January. But absent that, we still have a lot of work to do to push these arguments and to get going forward. So with that, I want to turn it over and we'll have a discussion here. And I'm going to start with the question of sort of where are we today? How are we doing? What have we been, how's things been going in the last 10 years? What's the current state of things? And I want to start with Cliff. I know it's a radical idea, Cliff, to base these discussions on data, but maybe you could do that for us.
I try to be, cutting edge of the way I do things. I passed out some graphs that were Rob kindly put at the front desk, and when I have discussions like this, I want the audience to leave with high-impact points. And one of the best is simply looking at the progress of manufacturing in its effort to recover from the Great Recession. The Great Recession was the deepest and most destabilizing economic downturn of any of our lifetimes. Peak to trough, GDP lost a little more than 4%, 4.2%. But it recovered for the broad economy, and in 2011, we had regained our output that was lost, and since then we've had a modest to moderate economic recovery. What about manufacturing? Peak to trough, and the trough for manufacturing and the broad economy were both in June 2009 this time. Not always the case, but it was in this cycle. Peak to trough, as the graph shows, manufacturing lost 21%. 21% of its output. Now, it's not unusual to see a stronger swing, both up and down, in manufacturing than the broad economy. It's just a more volatile output series. How's it doing now? Well, I mean, the broad economy recovered, I think, the third quarter of 2011. Manufacturing, as of the latest data point, is still about 4.7% below the peak. 8.5 years later, the manufacturing sector has not recovered. Just for a thought experiment, I just put out my, my quarterly forecast, fourth quarter forecast, goes out to 2021, and using my forecast, if I'm correct, by the end of 2021, we will still be struggling to get our manufacturing output back. That's a sector that's crying out for help. That's a sector that is not functioning properly. And I don't want to take up too much time, but when I had the privilege of speaking here in January at another ITIF event on manufacturing, I put forth a policy paradigm. One of the things I've talked about is productivity, which I spent more than a year of intensive study and research on, because productivity has fallen off dramatically. Between 2011 and 2016, manufacturing productivity growth has averaged 1.2%, down from 5.5% in the 2003 to 2007 period. It's not a measurement problem. It's concomitant with the productivity problem that the broad U.S. economy has, and that indeed the global economy has. That's not a sector that's doing well. We've got work to do, and those data points are a cry for help. That person is crying right now. And that's where I'll start.
Thank you. By the way, there's seats right up here, 2 seats here, there's a seat there, so feel free to come on. Thank you, Cliff. One of the things also that Cliff didn't allude to, although I know he knows it, not counting the last quarter, which I haven't looked at, the prior 10 quarters had negative manufacturing productivity growth. So that's never happened in American history before, negative manufacturing productivity growth. So the ability to be able to thrive fundamentally has to be around that. Phil, one of the key factors in U.S. manufacturing is it's the only sector, by the way, this is, by the way, Clyde Art, my 4th book, so I'm hawking it here, and a new book from MIT Press coming out in the spring called Big is Beautiful. We look at firm size economics, and manufacturing is the only sector in the U.S. economy where we've seen a decline of firm size. And that's in part because a lot of smaller firms are able to get innovation and efficiencies from these new technologies. So they're making up a big portion of our sector. Phil, how do you see that all playing out? How are they doing? What are their challenges? Well, let's move on to their challenges later, but how are they doing and what's going on there?
Well, so the firms that have survived the Great Recession are much more resilient and productive and competitive, but as you said, the total agglomeration of firms is much smaller, and I think this reflects a broader and more fundamental problem in our supply chain. So there are approximately 300,000 manufacturing facilities in the United States, of which virtually all, over 99%, are under 500 employees, and that's the definition, the conventional definition of a small manufacturer. And these small manufacturers are really the base of our supply chain to our large OEMs and global OEMs. So they're really the core, the foundation of our domestic manufacturing capability. And the problem that has emerged over the last 35 years is that the relationships between the OEMs and their suppliers have transitioned from inside the firm walls, when there were vertically integrated corporations that controlled all aspects of the supply chain from R&D to distribution, to an outsourcing based upon the trends of the last 35 years, in which the relationships between the OEMs and their suppliers are now market relationships. And because these are market relationships, they're hands-off transactions. And as a consequence, there is a classic economic market failure in those relationships. And the result of that is that there is a societal underinvestment in our supply chains. So the issue is not the performance of or the survival of an individual firm, but the health of the entire supply chain. And the market failure calls for a public response. Market failure is the way we policymakers in Washington, I'd call it a new Washington consensus, define an appropriate role for public intervention. So, for example, R&D is a positive externality, which means that there are benefits that accrue to the broader public. That's a rationale for public intervention. Pollution, there are negative externalities, so there's a call for regulation to prevent that from occurring to innocent third parties. It's analogous in the case of suppliers. There is a societal underinvestment which is degrading our manufacturing capacity, and this calls for a public response. And as I'm sure we'll get into later, historically, our public responses to the needs of individual firms in the supply chain have been underfunded, uncoordinated, and bureaucratically constrained. This is a challenge for all of us. It's a particular area of need which is not widely recognized in the broader discussion of the relationship between manufacturing, innovation, and productivity. And I hope that our discussion this morning will lead to some more brainstorming on this issue.
Great. Clyde, I want to come to you in a minute, but I just want to stay on the supply chain. If you have, feel free to have any of you weigh in on that. But I was speaking with a CEO of a technology company a number of years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, and he was explaining that they had this really new innovative product, and I said, "That's fantastic. Where are you going to make that?" He said, I think he said Singapore or somewhere over in Asia, and I said, how come? Because maybe it was China. Lower cost? Oh, no. The suppliers who we need are not in the United States anymore. We looked, we couldn't find them. And you think about this, the sort of big case with Carrier recently when President Trump intervened there. And Carrier was moving to Mexico, partly for cost reasons, but partly because the sort of gravity of suppliers had already moved there. So you have this chicken or egg question with, as you get weaker in your supply base, your OEMs have a harder time. They tend to move, which makes it harder for the suppliers. And that goes to fill your point about the externalities. Thoughts from anybody on that? Do you agree with that analysis, and how do other countries deal with it?
Rob, if I can join in here. Yes, very much so. And it's concomitant, it's tantamount to thinking about entrepreneurship in manufacturing. And I say this mindful of the piece that you just put out on tech startups. But we can solve a few problems at once if we think about a public investment in manufacturing entrepreneurship, because what you'll get as startups are suppliers. It used to be a very difficult thing to start a manufacturing business. You need, specialized knowledge, you need specialized workers, specialized supply lines. But one of the things that all of this automation innovation is doing is that it allows solo entrepreneurs, new entrepreneurs, to scale more quickly. You can be a one-person food business and have a more interesting scale geometry, which would attract venture capital. So let's leverage automation on the supply side to encourage new entrants into manufacturing. That will partially, at least to some extent, take care of the supply-based problem, which is getting worse and worse in this country.
Clyde?
Well, I think with regard to the supply place, really all of it, the role of government, or the lack of role of government, is pretty decisive. So Singapore, for example, I think is maybe Singapore and maybe the Italian or the Irish Development Authority are the world champions. But they scour the world looking for key companies and what those key companies need. And then once they figure that out, they approach company A and they say, hey, have you thought about Singapore? And maybe they have and maybe they haven't, but the Singaporeans then proceed to say, well, if you did come to Singapore, of course we give you the land free, and you get utilities at half cost, and no taxes for 25 years. And by the way, your key supplier X is coming, and your key supplier Y is coming, so why don't you come? And it's a powerful combination. I was involved personally in one case of a company in Livermore, a startup company that had a fantastic product, and they were dominant in the market, but then the Koreans, Hynix in particular, copied them. They went through a long patent fight in Korea, which of course they lost at the Supreme Court.
In Korea.
And finally, in desperation, the guy came to me and he said, Clyde, can you do anything? And I said, well, probably not, except that at this moment, the U.S. is negotiating a free trade agreement with Korea, and I know the Koreans want it, I know the Americans want it, and so maybe that gives us some leverage for your case. So I brought this guy to Washington, and we made all the rounds. The State Department, we went to the National Security Council, we went to Commerce, USTR. And while we're at Commerce, we're meeting with the Undersecretary of Commerce for International Trade. Right. Now, if there is one person in the U.S. government who is responsible for American exports and the competitiveness of American industry, that's the guy. So we're telling this guy our story, and he says to us, well, have you thought of moving your company to Singapore? And we rolled our eyes because the very next week, the Singaporeans had made appointments to visit us in Livermore to persuade us to go to Singapore. And so the U.S. not only do we not have any kind of program or industrial policy or investment policy to counter that, but our own guys promote it and promote the offshoring of our manufacturing. And so as long as that attitude prevails, it's hard to see how we change.
By the way, there are good parts of the Department of Commerce, which is where Phil is. So.
Thank you.
So I'm going to disagree with Clyde, because I think we do have an industrial policy, but we think it's 1945. And we think we can do anything we want in the world because we're the dominant economic hegemon. Well, this is obviously no longer the case. And what Rob has pointed to, and the other speakers, is that every country around the world are peer competitors: China, Japan, Germany, Canada have programs to shore up their industrial base and their small manufacturers. And this is no secret. Chuck Wessner, who's here, wrote a significant study in 2013, 21st Century Manufacturing, which looked at what our competitor nations were investing in the kinds of programs that we are lacking in the United States. And Suzanne Berger from MIT's Making in America, also in 2013, talked about the world competitive environment and said that in comparison to German firms, American firms are home alone. There is no supporting infrastructure in capital, in technology, in workforce, at a scale that is commensurate and required for global competitiveness. So this is a very significant blind spot that we have. We think that we can, we can have pure capitalism in one country when the rest of the world does not align itself with that theory.
It's a little bit like the new book on Stalin, where they had a debate whether they could have communism in one country or not, where under the belief we can have capitalism in only one country. I want to switch over a little bit to kind of what to do, and then I do want to leave a little bit of time before the next panel for questions or comments from the audience. What to do, obviously, is very complicated and lots of different components that are going to be needed. There's not a single bullet here, but I do want to go to Clyde's point about sometimes the failure of, I think, a couple of failures. One, failure of just recognizing what we need to do and how important it is. Secondly, a failure of coordination and sort of an all of government approach to this. What are some thoughts, first of all, about kind of an institutional solutions or approaches and analytical? We don't do a very good job of analysis. We don't do a very good job, I believe, on institutional coordination. And then we can maybe jump a little bit into specifics. Any thoughts on that? And Clyde, you want to jump off on that?
Yeah. Well, I think at the very beginning, there are two things. One is that, as you know, Rob, we used to have an office of, I've forgotten the official title, but keeping track of high technology, Congressional.
Technology Administration.
Right. And that expanded, like, to be an organism that would keep track of competitiveness, I think would be a powerful kind of tool. Like the Congressional Budget Office, an independent, constant analyzer of competitiveness.
Office of Technology Assessment.
Yeah. I think that we're tremendously inhibited in the U.S. because our leading economists teach and promote the doctrine that that free trade is always win-win, and implicit in that is the notion that what you make doesn't matter. And both points are really dangerously wrong. The win-win idea of free trade is based on a narrow set of assumptions. You assume comparative advantage in a context of, if you assume that that you have fixed exchange rates, that there are no cross-border movements of capital, and no cross-border movements of people or technology, and if you assume perfect markets so that there's no cost of adjustment when you lose your job, you immediately get a new job of equal worth. If you assume all that, then comparative advantage works. And that was the way the world was for a short moment between 1945 and 1935. 1935 and 1975. But those circumstances have passed. And the fact is that industries with economies of scale generate wealth. I think one mistake we make is we always talk about manufacturing in terms of employment. We want more manufacturing employment. Actually, we don't necessarily want more manufacturing employment. We want more manufacturing, but actually the more manufacturing we can do with less people, the more productive we are, and that creates wealth. And we should be talking, in my view, about the wealth creation of manufacturing and not so much the job element of manufacturing.
Great.
So those are just a few thoughts.
I'd like to see this productivity problem solved. And my research, which used an increasingly rich data set that the BLS has on industry-level labor productivity surveys, revealed three things that need to be worked on. And I don't think anybody would be totally surprised by them. One is capital investment. We've had this capital investment malaise since 2000, roughly. We talk and talk about it, but there's no action. And there are ways of incentivizing stronger capital investment. And, you know, I'll pay tribute to Robert Solow, who taught us that capital investment is the way that innovation spreads throughout the supply chain. Bringing me to the second variable, we are weak in innovation. Private innovation investment has fallen off, and public innovation needs some work too. The public investment in basic research and development peaked in the Apollo era. We need to start doing something about that. And I also found that we have a fall in the labor force participation of educated labor with a BA degree and higher. It's not a surprise, therefore, that all that has caught up with manufacturing productivity. Productivity is the muscle. It's what we take, you know, to the playing field to compete with. Those things are difficult, but they're not impossible. We don't have to spend a great deal of money or rearrange the way we do things to push productivity forward. Second of all, I'd like to see us leverage the complexity, the wonderful complexity of the U.S. economy. We have well-defined regional economies, and I have done, you know, you become a product of your own work and your own thinking, and I've done some work on cluster analysis. And I think clusters, either formed naturally or by policy fiat, can be very strong ways of dealing with the complex reality of global supply chains these days. I mean, manufacturing competitiveness in the Pacific Northwest does not mean the same thing as manufacturing competitiveness in the South. We need to leverage, you know, the comparative advantages of our regions about doing something about that. And then third is getting back to say, let's incentivize, and this can be a public investment, more manufacturing entrepreneurship. I'm not saying it's a perfect paradigm, but I think if we do those three things, we will really make a good start toward regaining U.S. industrial leadership, and they are not hyper expensive. They are not a complete change in American society or in the American economic philosophy or of economic governance. We can do that. It's just a matter of being aware of what's needed.
Phil, before you jump in, let me quickly. Cliff, I absolutely agree with that. I think one of the things, there's a lot of controversy over the current tax reform proposals in the House and the Senate, but I do think one very positive component of both versions of that bill is that they allow first-year expensing.
Absolutely.
And at the margin, that is going to encourage more CapEx because it makes the ROI better and faster. The second thing I would just encourage, particularly if there's Senate folks, staff here, there's a bill in the Senate. It's called the Manufacturing Communities Act, which is a very, very strong bill, and it would help to get at that, to support these subnational efforts and really get them up to scale. Phil.
So I'd like to tie together Cliff's comment about regional economies and Clyde's comment about trade. So in the 1990s, I served as Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Economic Development. I headed the Economic Development Administration, which funded, and still does, economically disadvantaged communities for revitalization programs. And I remember in 1999 attending a meeting at the Executive Office Building with OMB and the National Economic Council to talk about a response to the steel industry crisis in West Virginia. And when it got my turn to speak, I talked about all the programs that we had to help communities and workers and companies. And I was laughed out of the room. this was the old economy. We shouldn't enable failing industries. Much more important was nanotechnology. After the election, I saw an interview with former President Clinton, who mused that if they had paid more attention to the steel industry in West Virginia, they might have won West Virginia's 4 electoral votes, and with it the 2000 election. My experience in the 90s looking at NAFTA and subsequent responses to trade, in which there is, as Clyde correctly points out, winners and many losers, is that we have had a feeble response to trade adjustment. These are afterthought programs that are underfunded. The NAFTA response was really trivial. I saw that from inside the administration. And as a consequence, communities, companies, and workers all suffered. And I think we have seen the political consequences of that economic destruction across the country. We need more. We have programs such as EDA's Trade Adjustment Assistance for Firms, as well as the MEP program, that work with those small companies that are the base of our industrial activity in rural communities and small metro areas. And this is not magic. This is, as Cliff says, we don't have to develop new theories of economic governance. We need to make modest investments, single-digit billions, that can generate the kind of entrepreneurial activity, both new companies and within existing companies, that can create a more robust manufacturing capability in the country.
So I want to open it up before the Phil. What's the MEP budget? About 120?
130.
130, which is, by the way, what the budget was 15 years ago, more or less.
It did not increase a penny under the prior administration.
So if we were to match,
this is a bipartisan,
if we were to match what the Japanese spend on their MEP program, which they do have a very strong program like that, we would be spending about $5 billion a year. If we were to match what the German program is, again, they have a very strong supply chain support program, we would be spending about $3 billion a year.
Or if we were to match what the Canadians spend, right, our enemies to the north, we would be spending at least twice as much, which represents, and they have 1/10 of our economy. So we're really fighting these global trade battles with both hands tied behind our backs.
Questions? If you just want to raise your hand and identify yourself. Wow. Okay. I'm going to go in the order I see him. Chuck, and then here. Wait for the mic, please.
Just fighting some of the depression here. But a question for you, Rob, with your earlier remarks. Why do you think it is so hard to penetrate the economics profession? Why can't we get some effective? I mean, reality keeps crashing in on the shore, and at the same, and I mean this constructively, not just. Why can't we penetrate that at all?
So it's a little bit like why chiropractors can't be taught to cure cancer. Chiropractors know nothing about oncology, okay? And I'm not being flip. What do economists learn? They learn two things. They learn calculus, and they learn markets. This is not a market question. This is not about the agora out there of price-mediated transaction. This is about institutions. Economists simply do not study institutions. Again, it's like asking a chiropractor. You can't ask market-based economists. If you want to ask an economist, what do they know? They know about interest rates. Very, very good at that. They can tell you about if you raise the price of something, something will happen. Very good at that. Wonderful. We need that. They just simply are poorly, if ill-equipped at all, to even have a way to analyze these kinds of institutional meso-level questions, innovation questions. I mean, when you look at Greg Mankew's textbook, sort of one of the leading macroeconomics textbooks in the country, and you try to find in that 400-page textbook a discussion of innovation. It's on one page, and the example is the electric ice cream maker. I'm not making this up. I'm not making this up. And what does he say about that? Innovation is sort of nice, and it happens on its own. So I really think at one fundamental level, we got to do two things. You got to sort of retrain economists, which takes a long time. And more importantly, we have to just basically get the media and others to just say, when we're talking about cancer, or in this case, manufacturing, we're going to go with the oncologists, and we're going to go with people like Cliff, who really is an institutional economist. And when we're talking about interest rates, that's where we'll let the other economists have a say. The problem is they've sort of forced their way into these discussions to make themselves look like they're experts and have expertise, and they really do not have expertise here. That's a long slog to get there, but I do think that's the real reason. Yes, sir, right here.
Thank you. Luke Lorenz, the Nonpartisan Policy Alliance. One topic that was not discussed in too much detail here today was the lack of skilled workers for these advanced facilities. I was curious what your thoughts are on promising programs or what your recommendations would be for training the next generation of manufacturing workers. And I would specifically like to ask about the creation of a nationwide apprenticeship tax credit program, if you've heard anything about that.
Cliff, you want to?
The U.S. spends as a share of GDP the lowest in the OECD, among the OECD countries on apprenticeships, and they are programs that have proven to work. Listen, I speak to manufacturing audiences all around the country, and this is the one thing that I hear about more than anything else. I do think we need some more research on it. I don't think we have quite the insights we need to know. Remember, this is manufacturing is creative destruction on steroids. Thus, it is probably the case that truly new jobs, and we talk about job creation, but truly new jobs, jobs that have no comparable architecture and history are being created all the time. And in a period of disruptive process innovation like we are now, we are probably always, the labor pool is always probably falling behind. So I think we really need to sort of understand this more, but we also need to realize that there are things that other countries that have done that have proven successful. I speak to German economists all the time. I am not advocating the German model for us. It's a very different culture, but I do think that we can learn from apprenticeships, from changing the way that we educate. We have to stop stuffing all these kids into universities who come out with 4-year degrees and large amounts of debt, and realize that our community colleges, our vocational colleges, are rich resources that we underutilize. So in sum, I think we need better research. We need to really understand the problem better than we do. But we also have to realize that other countries have been smart in this, and that we need to also.
Great. Yes. There, hold on for the mic. It'll be right here.
Thank you. That's the wake-up call.
So, thank you very much for having me, given this opportunity of being here. Actually, it's by chance I'm here because. Can you
say who you are?
Sorry?
Say who you are.
Yeah, my name is. I'm going to say it.
Okay.
Okay. Good. So I'm by chance here because yesterday we had an interesting meeting between NSF and the Cluster Intelligent Factories in Italy, and I am Professor Tullio Toglio from Politecnico di Milano, and I am actually the president of the Scientific Technical Committee of the cluster. So this meeting was in the Italian embassy, and the idea was to create cooperation. Actually, I'm also part of the EU high-level group on key enabling technologies that is actually defining the ideas for the new framework program of the EU. So this discussion is exactly the one that we are carrying out at European level, so it's very interesting. Now, I would like to mention 2 points, if I can. First one, capital is important. I totally agree. And in Italy, there was a big plan last year supported by the Ministry of Economic Development to acquire capital goods. And capital goods make the backbone of the industry. So it's a program of around 20 billion euro in acquisition of new capital goods, and that increased the capacity of acquiring capital goods of 10% in Italy in comparison to the previous year. So this, I think, is something that is needed in all the countries if you want to create a strong manufacturing basis. So this is a first point. The second point, I really like the point that we cannot compete in a world where one is using certain rules, perfect market, and the other is using a different rule. Okay, we had in last year the acquisition by Chinese of KUKA in Germany. You know, KUKA, you maybe don't know, is the biggest producer of robots in Europe. And it has been supported by the public research funding in the previous 20 years. And has been acquired by Chinese because it's strategic. You know, they paid a lot for that, obviously, but it's strategic. People don't know also that in the same time, Chinese acquired other companies in Italy that are integrating robots. So they are doing that with a very clear strategy. Now, if you leave the company, bargain alone in this situation, it's obvious that they will acquire the whole supply chain. So this is critical because it happened already, for instance, in the aeronautical sector. When the Chinese wanted to launch their activities in the aeronautical sector, they bought a lot of companies in Europe that were producing machines for the aeronautical sector. But if you look at a single company, it's very, very small. So you don't say, okay, they bought this company, what's the problem? But if you look at the whole plan, it's a big plan, Yeah. And you lose a lot of capacity, or you give, let's say, a lot of knowledge in this way.
Great. Okay, so we're going to wrap up. Clyde, you just want to respond to that? You've been thinking a lot about that.
Yeah, well, I think that it comes back to kind of my earlier comment that a lot of things go into creating an effective manufacturing base and a manufacturing strategy. Last night I made the point that China has a program, Made in China 2025. The United States doesn't have Made in America 2025. It seems to me that until...
We have Made in China 2025.
Until we in the U.S. begin to understand that that competition, economic competition, is to a great extent among nations and not just companies, we will not come up with the right responses. I mean, we need to address our currency policy. The dollar is chronically overvalued. You can train and have skills and coordination all you want, but if the dollar is overvalued, it's going to be hard to be successful. We don't have any effective response to investment incentives. So I'm on the board of a high-tech company that has been under pressure to put a factory in China. And the way it works is that Chinese authorities, when they meet with executives of this company, constantly say, look, you should put a factory in China. And don't you understand you need to maintain a high image in China? And you ask yourself, what do you mean high image? Well, look, you idiot, we don't have rule of law in this country. And if you don't look like you're supporting China, well, bad things can happen. The death of 1,000 cuts could happen to you. But, tell us how much your factory costs. About $8 billion. Oh, well, we could give you the land free, no taxes for 25 years, utilities at half cost, $1 billion capital grant. How does that all sound? Well, it sounds pretty good. And many companies do that. We saw Jeff Immelt a couple of years ago at General Electric. move his whole avionics division to China. China doesn't have any particular comparative advantage in avionics. It's not labor intensive. What was going on? And Jeff was chairman of Obama's Commission on Jobs and Competitiveness. But Jeff got hijacked by the Chinese. So until we have a recognition of that and a response, I think, you know, we don't go very far. Thank you.
Thank you. So I just want to also add your point about them buying the robot company in Germany and all, and they do that here. I do think as we consider CFIUS reform, which Senator Cornyn is championing, I do think it's really critical to understand that we need to differentiate between our democratic and sort of market-based allies. If the Canadians buy one of our companies, or the Germans buy one of our companies, the Japanese, you know, we buy their companies, they buy our companies, generally pretty good. It's really very, very different when a country like China, when a Chinese company backed by the state, directed by the state, is buying our company. I think we need to really understand as we move forward in this that we need a differentiated set of policies and not just sort of this blanket kind of policies. And that goes to a lot of other points that Clyde just raised. With that, if you can all be patient, we're going to switch panels here. We're going to do that very, very briskly. And we'll wrap up with the panel, a deep dive on technology and where it's going and the policies, and hear from a couple of really innovative companies. So if I can invite Stephen and the next panelist to come on up, we'll get going.